I mean, there were those
Talk about
moments.
Phillip Randolph a little bit. I've talked about him on this show with Adolph Reed. If you go back, incredibly important figure.
Absolutely, truly incredible. One of the greats of the 20th century. So Phillip Randolph was, ever since had begun in the 1920s, he became the head of, the president, I think was the title, of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which, by the way, was not just a black union. It was a black union that had communications all over the country, because these were the guys who were on the Pullman cars that were traveling the country. These guys could get off in any city they had to get off in and basically organize and mobilize. So
can I just give a random, just to illustrate this? There's a book. I read this literally when I was a kid. It's probably one of the first books I ever read, called The Delaney Sisters' First 100 Years. They were a pair of African-American sisters. I grew up in the South, and they were among many siblings, and they ended up in New York, and they both happened to live to over 100 years old. So they ended up getting this book contract, but one of them was, like, I think the first African-American woman dentist in Brooklyn, I think. The other, they had these, but their lives charted everything from the apartheid Jim Crow South to the Great Migration. And so I understood one of their brothers was a Pullman porter.
yeah.
And explaining the power of that union and the significance in African-American political organizing of that was mind-blowing, even as a kid.
Absolutely. And the best example I can give you, and let's also note that Phillip Randolph was a socialist with a capital S, and the head of the labor union, and he took that labor union into the AFL, American Federation of Labor. Some people felt he should have broken and moved to the later CIO, but he stuck with them because they had taken in this black union to begin with. Okay, so in 1941, when Roosevelt gave the Four Freedoms speech, Randolph heard the speech and treated it as a moment to mobilize a march on Washington, with the idea of demanding the desegregation of the defense industries, and also possibly the desegregation of the U.S. military and the Jim Crow segregation of the U.S. military. And he decided that they were going to take to D.C. Originally, the thought was 10,000 African Americans, and no whites were to be in the march. This was going to be self-liberation, we'll call it, okay? And in order to get this revved up, he sent his Pullman Union brothers around the country to organize in black churches, black local chapters, fraternal organizations, and they held pretty sizable gatherings and protests in places like Chicago, in preparation for what would be a late June or July march in Washington. Now, FDR heard that, and he said, well, he's a little worried. He wasn't worried about Phillip Randolph and the marchers. He was worried about what whites in D.C. might do, because it was a segregated city. Right. Wilson had segregated the District of Columbia.
Great villain. We have to talk about that great villain someday.
Someday. Yeah. Okay. So he asked Eleanor to negotiate with Phillip. He had already been to the White House, Randolph, but the fact was he asked Eleanor, who was on really good terms with Randolph, to negotiate, to talk him out of bringing them to Washington. And I can't help but imagine that when Eleanor went, she didn't try to dissuade him from it.
I would imagine not.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And Randolph was pretty much convinced that once he got to the White House, which is what Roosevelt did, he invited him to the White House to talk about it. He was pretty much convinced there was no way that Roosevelt would bring him to the White House if he wasn't going to do something.
Right.
So in some ways, it was kind of like a theater moment, theatrical moment.
Sure.
And they're there, and he goes with Walter White to the White House. Walter White was the head of the NAACP. And Roosevelt asked, basically, how is it true you intend to bring this march to D.C.? This is as the story's told. And Randolph says, yeah. And Roosevelt says to him, well, how many are you planning to bring? And in his head, he was expecting to hear 10, 20,000. And Randolph, knowing the theatrical moment, said 100,000.
Right.
Which then did make Roosevelt sit back a bit and say, we really ought to do something. We ought to bring. So he signed the executive order ordering the creation of the Fair Employment Practice Commission, and basically this was the beginning of the desegregation of the defense industries. Now, Randolph said when he left, he wrote to a relative and said, I knew I was going to get something. There was just no question in his mind. But this is the Randolph who later,
Jobs and Justice.
And in 1940s, he called upon African Americans to boycott the U.S. military until it was desegregated, and Truman signed the order of desegregation. Right. Later, Randolph and Bayard Rustin together are the masterminds, and Rustin's the organizer of the March on Washington, which is for jobs. And basically, as you know, it was an economic and political march. Yeah. Which was enabled, and this is something
Adolph Reed, I mean, if I understand him correctly from our conversation, it's end American apartheid and Jim Crow, and then democratize the New Deal,
right?
So that social democracies for everybody.
And
in the
wake
States.
of the
and that's the battle we're still fighting.
Absolutely. And in the wake of that march is when Randolph begins to draw up his freedom budget. Now, the other interesting thing is in all of this is that what really enables the 250,000 people to turn out in D.C. is not only the determination of blacks and whites who are supporters of the struggle, but also the fact that Walter Reuther and the UAW underwrote the price of the buses to move people to D.C. Now, something else I'll just note, which is we all know the March on Washington in 1963 for the Martin Luther King speech, but I want to note that in 1944, I believe it was, Randolph spoke at Morehouse College in Atlanta, and King was like a precocious 15-year-old undergraduate there. And according to his own statement, it's Randolph who helped radicalize King.
Yes.
So here it's like then King is the one who gives the great speech in D.C. I mean, it's this.
There's also the global connection with some of the garb in that the white in that also I think actually traces back to King's interest in the Congress Party in India, which is another fascinating part of it.
Well, of course, we could go.
You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.